welcome to week 12 of this rainy season gardening journal thing. It's been a sort of fairly middling week, light rain, nothing particularly exciting as we draw into Tropical Storm Anna, which should be hitting round about tonight, so we'll see how much gets washed away with that. Famous last words. There shouldn't be anything particularly contentious or alarming this week. So with that said, I guess we should get into it. So I previously showed a clip of me pruning a mango tree, but it was very unclear, and so I thought, seeing as it's something I'm going to be doing a lot of, I will include at least one more clip of that, but this tree is more isolated, so hopefully I'll be able to get a clearer picture once I have, tied it up around it, side the way the grass, and pulled up the lantana and tried not to accidentally disembowel any dogs in the process. They do have actually quite a good sense of how clumsy I am, so they do tend to stay out of the way of anything I'm swinging, so don't worry too much about them. And besides, giving them a couple of mangoes will keep them preoccupied for a little while, at least. So with mango trees, when pruning, as I said the first time, I believe, one of the big things that I tend to focus on is leaving the outline of the tree intact and opening up the internal space. More or less, from anywhere underneath the tree, you should be able to look outwards at the leaves and see sunlight through them, but I wouldn't generally want to sort of create open spaces between the branches, so essentially you're sort of hollowing out the area within the canopy. This is in quite a lot of contrast to how I would prune certain trees, but this is generally what I would do with most fruit trees. We are going to actually talk about one of the exceptions there. So essentially, just if you find a branch that is a very different diameter, so for one of the rules of thumb I use is if a branch is as thick as my wrist and it has something coming off it that is thinner than my thumb, I wouldn't usually keep that unless that branch is going in a direction that I think is particularly useful. If a branch is heading inwards and is only likely to get shaded, I'll cut it off quite a lot close to the base, but otherwise with mangoes I tend to chase them outwards and outwards, and I also don't tend to trim the tips of the branches much, because I do find that tends to upset branches a lot more than taking off larger branches and water shoots further inside. So generally speaking, more of a folding saw job than a secateurs job with mangoes. Obviously then a year later, if you time it right and you are pruning them annually, it would be just clearing up water shoots for a little while, which is, again, you're looking for very thin branches coming off much thicker branches, which is the ones are not really going to be doing much in the way of fruiting. Again, if there is a branch, even if it is not the healthiest looking branch, but you think it's heading in the direction you want, and trying to prune off the unhealthy parts and encourage it and get light to it is what I would try to do, but effectively just opening up so you have a sort of ball canopy and light can get through to all parts of it is where I go with mangoes. So this is in quite a lot of contrast to how I would prune guava trees specifically. Now, most fruit trees I would always avoid pruning when they are flowering or beginning to fruit. With a lot of them, especially actually mangoes, when they are fairly late in the fruiting, it doesn't hurt to prune them. It's quite a good time in terms of their growth to take back a small amount without worrying that you're over stressing them. But especially because our trees are unirrigated, generally I will avoid pruning fruit trees when they are coming into fruit or flower. This is not the case with guavas. Perhaps counterintuitively, I tend to try and prune guavas to reduce the quantity of fruiting, because whether by improving the health of the tree or just reducing the attraction to insect pests, reducing the amount of fruit that a guava tree produces usually results, at least with our guavas, in an improvement in the quality of fruit. With smaller guava trees, with guava trees generally, I would prune them at any time of year, but with guavas generally, especially when they're coming into fruit, what I tend to do is do a lot more small branch pruning. So there's a lot more use of secateurs, there's a lot more taking off of the green branches towards the end. Usually I don't think it's within the first year of growth that branches fruit. I think it's usually second year. But if you're taking off the little twigs with flowers coming on or small fruits coming on, then you end up, in my experience anyway, getting larger and often healthier fruit, and because there is less of it falling off, creating just this massive carpet of maggot food, basically, you tend to get less unthinkable populations of fruit flies everywhere, which does mean that you don't have to worry so much about finding maggots in your fruit, which is not really ideal. Generally, I mean, I guess it's extra protein. With guavas as well, with these more mature ones, I am not sort of topping them. I'm letting them stay high, because a lot of the time the higher branches do tend to have fewer insect pests on their fruit. A lot of the time the fruit flies are coming up from fallen fruit, and they get into the fruit on the tree that way. And as much as trying to pick from these higher branches is generally not very straightforward, I do quite like it then, because they are often used by birds nesting. There was actually a small, not currently in use, nest up in the top of this one. But with smaller, younger guava trees, I am generally trying to top them to keep them within a picking reach, which also keeps them small enough that I can, stay on top of how much fruit they're producing. Next up was quite a different thing, different little challenge. So this is a hedge of Brazilian cherry. I sometimes call it Suriname cherry as well, because I believe there is also an unrelated plant that gets the name Brazilian cherry. But it's also native to Suriname and also called Suriname cherry. It is a very nice hedge forming plant, but more than that, it's a very nice fruiting plant when it fruits, but it seems to have a slightly unpredictable fruiting cycle here. And I was thinking, because some of the individual young trees of this were fruiting currently, that this might be about to come into flower, so I didn't want it cut back too heavily, but it was starting to block the drive a little. So I just basically trimmed it back a bit, just to allow a bit more access and hopefully give a little bit more time before anyone cuts it back too hard for it blocking access to cars, which means that if it is about to flower, we can still get fruit and not cut it when it's actually flowering or fruiting. But it didn't seem to be, so I'll give it a couple more weeks, and if it's still not doing anything, then I will then I will finish pruning it back quite hard, because it does need to be taken back quite a bit more than I'm doing here. I mentioned last week that I'm working on a map, and that is still true, but it's not been going swimmingly as I try and sort of decide what I should and shouldn't include, and overcomplicate things, as always. But to sort of put you in perspective, this little bit of woodland chasing up, basically trying to try and scrub into woodland and help it turn itself into forest thereafter, is happening in the front field, which I'll be calling the sand olive field from now, which is basically between the pigeon peas and the mangoes that they're in line with, and the road. So you saw me chase up a couple of guava trees just now. When they're at this height, I'm literally just pruning off everything that is below my head, if there is anything above my head, and trying to get them up to a decent height, and then once they are above head height and they can be walked under, then I will start taking the tops off. There is quite a lot of lantana in this field, which was quite good because I had some anger to work out on a few things. Usually when one is as big as the one in question that I am currently dismantling, I would not actually try and dig it up, because what I do find is if you dig up a large lantana bush without letting sort of a lot of the root rot back, you disturb a lot of the soil and you basically create ideal situations for a lot more lantana to root. So I will have to find something drought tolerant to put into the space where this has come out, maybe one of the Madagascan calincos, to fill that space and stop it turning back into more lantana. But basically the more reasonable thing is pull up the ones that don't require digging and that aren't going to tear up the soil around them, and cut back the others, because this tends to lead to a certain amount of dieback on the root, and after enough time of doing this you will find there's a lot less disruption in theory, even when you cut back a large one. And on the bright side, as much as I rail against the lantana, every time it needs cutting back it is just more mulch, which is actually quite a good point to me to transition into a sort of explanation of why I am saying that I'm trying to encourage scrubland to turn into woodland and then help it turn itself into forest. So what I want effectively is to reduce the large, high silica and very flammable and not very edible to most herbivores grasses that are coming up here. And one way to do that is to change the soil biology. So by feeding the soil, I am encouraging different funguses to grow, which is going to change the plants that are going to thrive under the reign of that fungus. And in the Miombo belt, which is where we are, there are a lot of funguses which tend to favour trees over grasses, but they do need to be fed. And as the soil chemistry changes, those funguses will start to do better, and the funguses that support the grasses will do a little worse. Actually, I'm fairly sure a few of these grasses that are here are entirely independent of funguses. They're very much the type that you tend to see in over-fertilized fields, where basically the soil is just dead and the only survivors are the grasses that are tough enough that they just won't die. Some of them are more like canes than grasses, and they will very much grow entirely by themselves in a dead system. There is a lot more growing around their bases, which should start to become more apparent as they are less aggressive in their growth. But native trees do tend to pop up by themselves. One of the ones that's quite common and that is quite numerous in this picture once the lantana is taken out of it is the Sycamore Violet. Some people might call it a violet bush. It's quite toxic, but that will break down once it's broken off. It does have medical uses, but I am not ever going to try and use it for medicine because, again, as with the erythrina, it is a very fine line between toxicity and death. What is also coming up in this field is the Masasa, or Brachystegia spiciformis, which is the dominant tree of the Miombo. And so if I can chase those upwards, basically again pruning around the base and making them think something is browsing them, I can turn those into a medium height canopy under which fruit trees and other sort of native useful trees will start to grow in the newly sort of fungally rich and less grassland inclined soil. And a lot of our native trees, including some of our fruit trees actually, are legumes, which is all going to carry on improving and enriching the soil. So also, as well as adding sort of fungal depth to the soil, every bit of mulch you add on is a bit more carbon, which just is a bit more moisture retention for that soil. And in a country where you spend a very long time without any rain each year, and where, as the globe progresses and as countries around the world continue to make nothing more than vague commitments to actually reducing their carbon output. Having more sort of climate resilient soil is going to be very important for keeping fruit trees and perennial crops alive. And once these are high enough, and I mean it's already starting to happen, but some of the non-native fruit trees which are currently more saleable will start to take root. So as well as chocolate berry and mabola plum, which are both native fruit trees, and the governor's plum, which is a very widespread fruit tree, we have started to get mango seedlings and the inevitable guava seedlings, but that's more of a nuisance than anything else at this point, popping up amongst these trees. And now the ones that I eventually decide I don't want, they can be cut down, and they can be cut down again and again and again, like lantana if necessary, and each time they're cut down, it's just more for the soil and more for the trees that I do want. But the higher they get, and the more mixed that canopy is, the more of a reliable sort of shelter from the wind and the sun that these trees will become, and that will start to encourage more forest species. And there are Zambian trees, although I very much doubt they will seed themselves down here, that will eventually turn the brachysteges, the Masasa, from canopy to subcanopy. So yeah, so basically, if I can bring a wide range of trees, then I can make a more climate resilient forest. And I do believe that, with some caveats, that at our altitude and in the specific situation that we're in, the more climate resilient habitat is very much more closed woodland and forest than open grassland and scrub, because at the altitude we are at, with the challenges our climate will face, open woodland and scrub is going to turn very quickly into grassland and desert, whereas closed woodland and forest should be a lot more able to look after itself and shade any crops that I happen to be growing underneath it. It seems important to note at this point, this is opinion, not fact. These are ideas that I am exploring, not statements I am making. But anyway, it is time to go from the thoughts in my head to the thorns in my head, because we're going to go back to the sicklebush field, which is what I'm going to call the field where we planted the dracaenas and a lot of the young fruit trees earlier in the season, and a lot of the thorn of Christ that you saw go in. That's in the different parts of this field. Now, along one of the boundaries, because there should eventually be 8 small fields that I will divide up in this field, and there will be openings between them, which basically means they can be blocked or opened easily. So if I have crops in one, or if I want goats, for example, one day in one of them, then I can hopefully exclude them to a degree. I know excluding goats is not necessarily a science, it's more of a dream, but I will be able to exclude them. But I can move between the fields easily to scythe, and in this, hopefully by next year's agricultural show, very rich grass-fed soil, which I will buy cheap seeds at the end of the show and plant in. But one of the gateways is currently blocked by some very bushy sickle bushes, so I'm just chasing those up to create an opening. There are aloes planted on either side, and this is actually where a lot of the masao and sour plum seeds went in, so we will see if those come up alongside the aloes. Hopefully the aloes will remain a marker and a shade and protector for those, but certainly we saw last week the chickens have already decided to take away a few of the things they've planted, so by the end of the season they might have managed to kick up even these sickle bushes. Who knows? As you can see, the grass is very much enjoying itself, and I've scythed a bit of it down, but I will have to do a lot more, because it is coming up nice and fast, which just it's all biomass. I have to keep reminding myself of that every time I look out and feel like I'm Alice trying to keep up with the Red Queen. But yeah, so that is that for the sickle. Actually, no, that is not quite that for the sickle bush field this week. because there were also some of the wild mango seeds, and I still have no clear plan of what to do with the wild mango fruits. One of the interesting things about them is they actually ripen after they fall off, which I think is probably an elephant adaptation, which is also what I think is the cause for the masuku doing the same. But I have soaked a few of these and am planting them out, and hopefully at least a few of them will come up. Whether the water table is high enough here for them, I am unsure, but I remain hopeful. So yeah, so that should be it for this week. I will give I don't think it's really going to distress anyone particularly, but once the dogs have finished having a very well-earned soak in the water butt, there is going to be a picture of a cleg type of biting fly. You get them all over the world, so not particularly exciting, but one of our neighbours has some horses, and since they've had those, we've had a lot of these biting flies, which we didn't have before. But just be aware, there is going to be a picture of one biting me. They're pretty, but they're evil. And with that, I think that is everything for this week. So I will see you next Tuesday, bearing in mind that may only be Tuesday somewhere in the world and probably not where I am.